Miranda Edwards was born and raised in a small village nestled in the thick jungles of Colombia. Her parents were farmers who worked tirelessly to provide their 5 children with everything they needed. Miranda was the oldest of the 5, and therefore she had to take on most of the responsibility of caring for her siblings, since her parents were always very busy with work. She learned the value of money early on in her life, and by the age of 15, she was already working in the fields like the adults in her family. Unfortunately, the crop yield of the family decreased every year, which couldn't but upset Miranda's parents. There were many reasons behind it. The weather was one of the main ones. The moderate dry climate was replaced by prolonged rainy seasons in recent years, which made the jungle more humid. Having realized that she had become a burden to her parents, Miranda decided to try her luck in the city, and having reached the age of majority, moved out of her native village. "I'm not chasing you out, but if you fail, don't come back," her mother said in parting. Miranda nodded timidly and lowered her eyes. The big city both terrified and beckoned the young woman. At that point, the naive village woman had no idea how her life would change in the near future, which seemed so ghostly and mysterious. Miranda earned her first money by getting a job in the cleaning business. She got her clients through a staffing agency that helped people with no education to earn a living. Of course, this job didn't bring in a lot of money, but Miranda was accustomed to life's hardships and appreciated every peso she could earn. The young woman was never afraid to take on the most difficult work and was always happy with any order. Of course, several other young women worked at the agency along with Miranda, and that sometimes led to some serious competition between them. Life is a complicated thing, especially for a person living alone in a big city. Since Miranda didn't earn enough to rent her own housing, she had to be content with renting out a room from an old woman living in a very bad neighborhood. It was especially uncomfortable in the area at night, but Miranda knew that she couldn't count on anything or anyone to make her life easier. It was at this turning point that she met Matthias, who worked as a bricklayer at a construction site. The young people met at one of the construction sites where Miranda got hired as a cleaner. Matthias immediately noticed the modest beauty, who stole his heart right away. Just like Miranda, the young man came from the province, and therefore they immediately found things to talk about. Matthias plucked up the courage to make the first move and invited the young woman out on a date, which surprised most of his colleagues, who considered the young bricklayer to be very shy. The relationship between Matthias and Miranda developed so quickly that it gave hope for a brighter future for them both. They reached out to each other like the tender shoots reach for the sun. When Matthias and Miranda announced their engagement, this news didn't surprise any of their acquaintances or coworkers. Of course, the couple couldn't afford a big celebration and had to limit themselves to a modest dinner at a restaurant, which they both had long dreamed of visiting. At the same time, few people knew that the couple didn't rush to get married because they simply wanted to legitimize their relationship, but rather because Miranda was already pregnant. Since the young people managed to save up some money, they bought a small house on the outskirts of the city, which they hoped would become their cozy family nest. When little Leon was born, the happiness of young new parents knew no bounds. On that day, Matthias was ready to scream for joy, showering his beloved wife and son with kisses. Time seemed to fly by for the young people, busy building a life and raising their son together. 2 years later, Miranda gave birth to a daughter, whom the happy parents named Jamala. By that time, Miranda was no longer working, and therefore she devoted herself entirely to taking care of the family and their home. Time seemed to be flying by, turning into days, months, and years. Since the young mother was used to working hard since childhood, she managed to start a little farm even while raising her children. She kept several dozen chickens, geese, and ducks. The only thing that upset Miranda was the fact that her children weren't the least bit interested in taking part in her housework and caring for the animals. Instead of feeding the chickens or cleaning the poultry house, Leon and Jamala ran off to the lake, where they fished, swam, and just fooled around. Of course, there was nothing shameful in the kids' desire to enjoy their childhood, and Miranda, like any loving mother, tried not to worry about it. She remembered perfectly well the times when she had to spend her days working in the fields with her parents. And after her move to the city, Miranda talked to her mother only a couple of times, and the conversations didn't last longer than 5 minutes. Meanwhile, her father went as far as to consider her a traitor who left her family in a difficult time. Miranda was very hurt by her parents' attitude, because they never once came to visit their daughter and refused to attend her wedding or even come to see the birth of her 2 grandchildren. Nevertheless, Miranda's life could have probably been considered a happy one, at least until fate decided to make some unfortunate adjustments to it yet again. It happened shortly before Miranda's birthday, for which the woman was preparing ahead of time. Leon and Jamala were already teenagers and were attending the local high school. On that fateful evening, Miranda was making dinner and was extremely surprised to get a call from her husband's boss. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but there was an accident, and your husband, he died." The lines holding a concrete block broke and it collapsed on top of Matthews. "What? What do you mean he died?" Miranda exclaimed, unable to believe what she was hearing. Unfortunately, the horrible news delivered by the foreman turned out to be true. Miranda could barely remember anything that happened after that. The funeral of her beloved husband was like a nightmare come true for Miranda. After Mathias's death, Miranda's life quickly changed for the worse. Having become a widow, she desperately needed her children's support, but they didn't seem to understand it. Now, Miranda didn't only have to get a job, but also continue to take care of her little farm, which oftentimes was the family's only means of survival. Only then did the woman realize what a huge mistake it was to not teach her kids what hard work was when they were still little. Leon and Jamala grew up selfish and only ever thought of themselves. Leon was the first one to leave his parental home and start his independent adult life. Miranda didn't condemn him, as she did exactly the same thing when she was young. But unlike his mother, Leon wasn't as lucky and came back home a year later. Then Jamala also tried her hand at adult life. The young woman planned on finding a rich boyfriend and getting married. However, as one would expect, it didn't exactly work out as she'd hoped. Of course, Miranda let her kids come back home, trying not to think about what her parents told her back when she was moving out. Unlike her own parents, Miranda couldn't be so harsh with her children. She believed that one day Jamala and Leon would get their act together and everything in their lives would change for the better. But in the meantime, she made every effort to ensure that her children weren't in need of anything. Several years had passed. To Miranda's surprise, Jamala got married first, and a year later she gave birth to twins. Even though Leon was older, he didn't rush to start a family and only got married 5 years later. His wife was a rather opportunistic provincial woman who immediately laid eyes on Miranda's house. Her daughter-in-law's interest in the house stemmed from the fact that by that time, the area where the house was located had developed so much that the price of real estate there was very high. Leon and Jamala had repeatedly tried to talk their mother into selling their house and using the proceeds to buy 2 smaller houses in less developed parts of the city. "No, the best years of my life passed in this house. I lived my life here and I'm going to die here," Miranda answered, shaking her head. Thus, Leon and Jamala decided to come up with the plan to get their hands on their mother's house. Unfortunately, they didn't care about their mother's opinion on the matter, since they believed that she'd already lived long enough. The worst part for Miranda was that their children didn't even seem to notice how much she cared about her grandchildren, even though she was spending most of her savings on them. Despite her advanced age, Miranda continued to take care of the farm, where she was still raising chickens and geese. Unfortunately, Leon and Jamala grew up very selfish and only cared about money. Having laid eyes on their mother's house, there was no way to get them to give up on their intentions. One day, when Miranda went to see a doctor, Leon brought a lawyer to the house in order for him to draw up the necessary documents. The devious man had long come up with the plan to get his mother's house. Of course, Jamala was in on it. Frankly speaking, the young woman couldn't wait to finally get her share of the proceeds. When her children showed Miranda the documents, she understood everything without words. Having a hard time holding back her tears, the woman signed the documents, thereby making herself virtually homeless. Although it was only partly true. The old woman knew that somewhere in the middle of the dense jungle there was a very little village with her parental home. Miranda packed her things and hit the road, unable to stop thinking about the twists of fate that were about to bring her back to her homeland. At the same time, the woman refused to take the money that Leon offered so that she could rent a house to live in. Despite her advanced age, Miranda intended to start a new life. Of course, seeing the state her parents' home was in, Miranda couldn't help but start wondering whether she'd made the right choice. The outside of the house was covered with creepers and ivy, which made it look more like an evergreen hill than an actual house. Inside, everything was covered in mold, dust, and cobwebs. It took Miranda a lot of time and effort to clean the house and clear the land of weeds. Since the old woman had some money saved up, she bought some chickens and geese from the local farmers. The old woman knew that if she kept poultry, she would never be in danger of dying of hunger. Her efforts soon gave results. She got eggs from chickens, and her geese often had gooselings. Moreover, Miranda built a new paddock for wild animals injured by poachers or too old to look for food on their own. Of course, she didn't keep predators and herbivores together and tried to separate those warring species. Thus, Miranda got foxes, a couple of roe deer, and even an old leopard, whose teeth had long fallen out and he couldn't hurt, living on her farm. People from the surrounding villages came to see Miranda's impromptu zoo. They wanted to see the miracle created by this kind old woman. Meanwhile, Miranda's menagerie was expanding and developing, becoming even more bizarre and impressive at the same time. Soon, the rumors of the mysterious old woman spread well beyond the local villages, which brought crowds of tourists to Miranda's farm. They all wanted to see the miracle sanctuary lost in the impenetrable jungle. The influx of tourists made it possible for Miranda to earn some money, which she invested into developing her business. But the most important event in the woman's life happened a little later, when a family of tourists from North America came to visit her farm. They offered Miranda to buy a small hotel next to her house, where she could accommodate her visitors. Initially, Miranda thought that it would be too risky. But when the old woman realized that her guests were actually willing to help her out in this endeavor, she agreed to it. Soon, the word about this little hotel lost in the middle of the dense jungle spread far beyond the borders of Colombia. From that point on, it became a must-see for anyone who came to visit this country. Miranda was earning tons of money, which couldn't help but make her happy, since now she could help orphanages and nursing homes, as well as continue her work to help the animals. One day, a car stopped in front of Miranda's hotel, and a bunch of children and several adults got out of it. Taking a closer look at her visitors, Miranda gasped. Standing in front of her were Leon and Jamala, who had arrived with their families. "Hey, Mom, we decided to come visit you," Leon said, as if nothing had ever happened between them. Miranda smiled back and invited the guests to come inside. She suspected that Leon and Jamala hadn't achieved anything in their lives and had probably already spent all of their money they got from selling her house. Miranda didn't lecture her children and chose not to point out all of their shortcomings. Instead, she offered Leon and Jamala jobs at her hotel. Of course, those weren't managerial positions, which meant that her children would have to master what they didn't in childhood. Now, Jamala and Leon worked in the fields from morning to night, taking care of the animals, and even cleaned the pens and enclosures. Nevertheless, Miranda never exploited her children and paid them good wages. Moreover, the old woman took care of her grandchildren and tried to make their childhood truly happy. Miranda's life was full of hardships, but she dealt with all of them with dignity. Those who got to know this woman personally always noted how kind and compassionate she was. Well, all we can now say about Miranda is that she managed to find true happiness in her advanced age, when her kiddos and grandkiddos finally realized what true family values were.